I spoke in the original phonograph. A little piece of priceless poetry.
Some kids say that the world today is all upside down.
For nearly 100 years, America has had a love affair with radio.
The Lone Ranger.
Efforts to capitalize and profit from America's love of broadcasting led to amazing innovations, including the phonograph, transistor radio, reel-to-reel recording, 8-track tapes, the personal cassette tape player, CDs, iTunes, and iPods. But radio as we know it has had more than its share of conflict. Who invented radio? Who should control its content? How do we define radio to include handheld computers, satellite, and digital distribution? The controversy has raged in a dozen directions over the past century. Media wars happen when an established way of communicating is disrupted by the arrival of a new medium.
Jane Pratt from Jane Radio on Sirius XM Stars.
All media wars ultimately fought over the same thing: power over the channels of communication, monetary profit, and preservation of the status quo.
That's the reason that local advertisers get results. Deep daytime penetration of 112 counties gets results.
Radio was born out of the need to communicate to the masses. In the beginning, broadcasting sound was a matter of survival.
Radio is defined by a two-way communication between the listener and the audience and the sender. Things I like to classify as radio is anything that you could have line of interaction, change your content on the fly.
The wave of murder which is sweeping the eastern third of the nation is being committed by creatures who feast upon the flesh of their victims.
Be able to break in and give news coverage, weather, offer data services, talk, content.
According to Wikipedia, radio is the transmission of signals by modulation of electromagnetic waves with frequencies below those of visible light. Sounds complicated. For most of us, radio is something more like this.
B100 San Diego, making history in Southern California with the best stereo boogie.
Wolfman Jack playing your country.
No, we're just getting started. We're starting to percolate now. Let's talk 1-800-244-WCFL. Let us continue to continue. It's an all-request Friday night, and I want to hear from you.
While there is much debate about who exactly invented radio, many now believe the technology owes its beginnings to the great inventor, Nikola Tesla. Never heard of him? It's not surprising. He's been largely ignored by history, but his might have been the first radio war.
Nikola Tesla was a very well-known inventor in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He is actually the person who invented radio.
When Nikola Tesla invented his Tesla coils, he hoped to create a wireless form of high-voltage electricity for the masses.
In his lifetime, he was more interested in improving everybody's way of life and everybody's way of communication. He wasn't really so much after monetizing his inventions, but in making the world a better place.
Tesla envisioned cities with free-flowing wireless communication, entirely powered without cables. Electricity would be virtually free, but his main financier, J.P. Morgan, would not tolerate the idea. How would he make a profit from free electricity? He abruptly canceled his contract with Tesla and blackballed the inventor from working with other investors. But Tesla's invention to transmit electrical power without the use of wires led to another innovation. By tuning the coils to resonate at the same frequency, he discovered he could transmit and receive powerful radio signals. Nikola Tesla had created the basic design for the first radio.
Send the water to beware.
Of course, money talks, and with no financing, the inventor's progress came to a grinding halt. Meanwhile, the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company was having great success in the stock markets. Renowned businessmen like Thomas Edison and Andrew Carnegie invested in Marconi. On December 12, 1901, Marconi successfully transmitted and received the first transatlantic signal. It was the letter S in Morse code. Marconi became an international celebrity.
High in the Cascade Mountains of Washington, the Navy opens the world's largest radio transmitter. Its 1 million watts can flash a message around the world.
Communication during wartime to gain an advantage over the enemy was one of the first uses of radio.
An old Marconi operator himself, the general sends the first message using the type key on which he relayed the Titanic disaster messages. A ship or installation anywhere on the globe can be instantly reached from Radio Jim Creek, as the station is known. Answering messages begin coming in over the...
Throughout his life, Nikola Tesla tried to prove that he was the creator of radio.
He is actually the person who invented radio. Even though the history books gave Marconi the credit, he's the guy who had the first patents that were accepted with his patent office. So he deserves credit for being the father of radio. I don't want to upset anybody. I'm just telling you what the truth is.
The hour has come.
The lack of recognition received by Tesla during his lifetime and the opposition to his ideals eventually turned him into a tragic character well suited to dramatic fiction.
Total destruction will come to those who laughed at me and failed to heed my warnings. Beware, I strike at midnight. This nut may prove dangerous.
Tesla was ultimately ostracized by mainstream media and regarded as a mad scientist. It wasn't until 1943, 6 months after his death, that the war was finally ended and his patents were reinstated by the U.S. Supreme Court, affirming he was the originator of wireless technology and radio.
He did some amazing things as far as radio and electronics, and he died penniless in a hotel in New York City. It was money that basically drove him to poverty because he was more concerned with creating new things that people could use. That was his passion. His passion wasn't really about money.
Read all about it. Morning paper. Paper, mister?
In the early 1920s, the newspaper industry held a virtual monopoly over news gathering.
When NBC and CBS went on the air, they wanted to use news from the newspapers. And the newspapers who paid the Associated Press to gather the news wires didn't want what they perceived as their news to be used on the air.
They pick and choose the information that they want to put out to you, and it's about controlling your entire culture and your entire way of life. They want to dictate to you what you should do, what you should listen to, who you should believe.
Your daily newspaper. Well, this is familiar. Most of us read a paper every day. They give us tips on where to do our shopping. This is the advertising department, where they handle the advertising that helps so much to pay for the paper.
When radio began to grow beyond a mere basement hobby, some newspapers started getting nervous about the issue of radio news.
Will radio eventually supplant newspapers? Isn't it easier to turn a switch than to read an editorial?
The Bureau has replaced the large observatories of the country.
Radio offered a free channel for the dissemination of information.
The news doubled its schedule, went on the air 48 times a day. At almost any hour, day or night, the public could flip a dial and hear a newscast.
Print journalists were livid.
Radio is first with the news.
In 1922, the Associated Press issued a notice to its members that AP news bulletins were not to be used for the purposes of broadcasting, and spent nearly a decade trying to block the emergence of broadcast journalism.
When there's a new communication technology that's been developed, established media industries often react with resistance.
It's simply a part of the overall battle between the media, the old embedded media,
Read all about it.
and the new media.
Traffic is heavy with up to 1 hour delays on
Old media fighting to hold on to what they had. They have that power base. They influence the culture and the population. New media trying to get out the word that they have a good business model, they have a successful plan.
Radio shows were forced to find new ways of obtaining bulletins for their newscasts.
When the fire is under control, a first-hand report from the chief.
CBS and NBC were born out of this battle.
Thus, radio became vital to America. It has tuned us into the world and national news. As it grew, it became the very heartbeat of the community. And today, for hundreds of communities, the local radio station is the only source of immediate news.
The battle for media has taken many forms. The battle for control of information is as old as civilizations itself. And when new technologies have emerged that make it a lot easier to communicate to the masses, this is where the elitists get nervous.
When Nikola Tesla appears in the very first Superman cartoon, is it a coincidence that Clark Kent and Lois Lane worked for the Daily Planet newspaper?
Quiet, please. In exactly 15 seconds, we'll be on the air. Rubinoff and his violin.
And so, we're on the air. Let's see how the broadcast gets from the studio to your home. Of course, you don't hear the real sounds over your home radio. What you hear is a translation of the sounds. Sound travels in waves. The picture of a sound wave, if we could see it, would look very much like this. These sound waves, made by the musical instruments, travel in all directions at once. We want to make this wave stronger, so we amplify it here in the studio control room and again in the master control room. Each time we amplify it, the wave looks a little bigger, like this. Then it gets still bigger, more powerful, and finally, it thunders out of the power strong enough to carry it over a wide radius. This radio wave is then sent to the antenna from which it is released. It leaves the antenna as vibrations and travels in all directions with the speed of light. The wave spreads out for hundreds of miles, and finally, your own aerial picks up a small amount of the original vibrations. Radio waves from many programs are being picked up by your radio all the time.
AM radio operates off a principle called amplitude modulation. FM radio works on a principle known as frequency modulation.
Edwin Armstrong fought valiantly all his life to champion the inventions that have made modern radio possible.
Edwin Armstrong actually did a tremendous job of raising the money for and debugging all of the hurdles put in front of him to create working FM radio.
To Armstrong, one thing was clear. FM was vastly superior to AM, and the public had the right to its benefits. David Sarnoff, president of RCA, was impressed with Armstrong's ideas and for several years gave the inventor a studio at the top of the Empire State Building to conduct his experiments.
Have you seen the well-to-do up and down Park Avenue on that famous thoroughfare with their noses in the air. High hats and arrow collars, white spats and lots of dollars.
David Sarnoff came to the U.S. from Russia right after his birth in 1890-91. He and Edwin Armstrong were the same age. He joined the Marconi Corporation in New York as a shift supervisor initially and worked his way up.
Senator Marconi, I'm glad to welcome my friend and my teacher to the American shores. We're very happy to see you here.
David Sarnoff made his reputation by false claims that he was the man who intercepted and helped to process the radio signals coming in from the Titanic that it was sinking. It was later proved that he was not in fact involved at all, except as the supervisor of the unit that took those signals.
And he began what is now RCA. That's why the gentleman is a champ. To radio, what Edison was to lamp. That's why the gentleman is a champ.
David Sarnoff was very virulently opposed to the decision by the Patent Office in 1943, some 50 years after the fact, to declare Tesla, not Marconi, as the inventor of wireless communications. During that period of time, FM radio was a threat to the networks such as National Broadcasting Corp. And Radio Corporation of America, better known as RCA. They did not want to see FM become powerful enough or operative enough to actually create an economic conflict with AM radio, which they had such a huge investment in.
FM radio was so much better than AM that the whole established order of things was threatened. Thousands of expensive AM transmitters and millions of AM radios could become obsolete.
While the broadcasters, the people behind the microphones, were excited about it, the people who were not so welcoming were the owners, who were wondering, where's this all going? And geez, if I got to retrofit their equipment.
The established broadcasting radio networks, their investments, and their control over radio were in jeopardy.
The FCC had changed the frequency bands on it twice. And then there's a story that goes with that they changed the bands because there was some sort of underlying subterfuge at hand there, that they really didn't want it to progress too fast or even at all.
So what they did is they created hurdle after hurdle, which Edwin Armstrong managed to jump over. And finally, when his patents were ready to be issued, they stepped in and got the FM radio patent issued to David Sarnoff rather than to Edwin Armstrong. Exhausted at the age of 64, he jumped from the 13th floor of his condominium in New York. It's interesting, he took the time to dress properly, put on cuffs, cuff links, to put on his best suit, wear his best top coat, and then he ran out the window. And he landed on a ledge 3 floors above the street and was not found for 2 days.
For the longest time, AM was it. There was no FM. And then when FM was coming out, in actuality, the NAB kind of fought it. But eventually you had AM and FM radio. And what happened was AM stopped doing music and started doing talk programming, conservative talk, liberal talk.
Tragedy to the perpetrators. Ladies and gentlemen, again this evening, the Daily...
That was an adaptation. FM was better for music. You had stereo sound.
I want to sing and shout hallelujah when the saints go marching in. I want to sing early gate. I want to
Shotgun Tom Kelly in the morning. Good morning, baby. How you feeling? Oh, I'm feeling really good this morning.
there was this transition from AM radio over to FM. AM was very full of commercials and a little static. And it was just time to try something new.
FM presented this new quality. For pop radio particularly, was a pretty exciting thing.
I'm telling you, it was like it happened overnight. Once people went to FM, they never would go back. You can't go back to AM. It's kind of like once you have a car with air conditioning, you can't have a car without air conditioning. Once you went to color TV, you couldn't go back to black and white.
Media wars happen when an established way of communicating is disrupted by the arrival of a new medium.
Stereo FM made rock and roll really pop, really happen. And to be honest with you, I don't think there's been any improvement over that until satellite radio came along.
These radio wars of yesteryear could fill volumes in the history of media, but one of the biggest battles in broadcasting is still going on today.
Sirius XM radio.
There is a story in the satellite world.
XM satellite radio.
XM.
Don't let the sun.
The fastest growing entertainment media in history right now.
This was going to be bigger than life.
Pure controversy.
You talk about a media war or a radio war, that was one of the biggest battles ever.
Satellite radio, the king of all radio wars. Sirius Satellite Radio was created by a visionary named Martine Rothblatt. Back then, she was Martin Rothblatt, but that's another story. It was at the NASA tracking station during the summer of 1974 that she had an epiphany to unite the world via satellite communications.
I was traveling in East Africa. I was in Kenya in particular, and I was amazed that so many people there in the 1970s were listening to American music, like Michael Jackson was on the radio. I didn't even know there was a NASA station there. It's a real poor country. I was living in a hut full of cockroaches and billions of moths flying around at night. So we drove up this long, winding road to the top of the mountain, and there was a gleaming, beautiful, all-white, super sterile, big NASA tracking station with a giant radome. We went inside, and a really nice technician explained to us that this was part of NASA's deep space tracking network, and they were like listening to satellite signals from probes sent to other planets and around the Earth. And I asked him, why was the satellite dish so big? I mean, it was as large as a 3-story house. And he said because the satellite signals were so very faint and small. And I asked him, would it be possible for that satellite dish to be so small that it could fit in your hand? And he said it would be impossible with current technology because the satellites would have to be super powerful. But he said maybe in the future that would be possible. Then it just clicked in my head that all the people I saw in East Africa listening to American music off the radio could be listening to music all throughout the world if I could just launch some satellites that were powerful enough to make the dishes fit in the palm of my hand.
If you really do any research on Martine Rothblatt, you'll be really shocked at how smart she is. She's a very intelligent person. She's contributed a lot more than people think to not only satellite radio, but now biotechnology and pharmaceuticals.
Originally, when Rothblatt presented and asked for licensing from the FCC, the desire was for one service and one company.
When Martine originally presented the plan to the FCC, she wanted one company because she had enough foresight to know that it wouldn't work as two.
But the FCC decided to grant 2 licenses for satellite radio in the United States.
The model of satellite radio did not work with 2 companies because there was simply not enough demand for it at the time, and it was too exact similar a service. It would be something that the government should come in and step in if satellite got too big and force them into 2 companies. That would make sense. To do it from the beginning is backwards.